Recker.
Hello, Berente. I decided to start calling you with your last name only too.
No, that doesn't work well. But we've got a fun date. So what we're going to do today is talk about ethics. And in order to talk about ethics, I figured we should bring my good friend, Kirsten Martin, who's my colleague here at the University of Notre Dame, and who's perhaps the world's foremost expert on technology ethics. You're muted, Kirsten. Jeez, we just started and you're already muted.
I know, I was going to let you guys talk, but that's not true. But thank you.
Yeah,
thank
it is.
You.
Well, that's how I sell you anyway. Anyway, so Kirsten, we've had a session on ethics, and both Recker and I are very concerned with ethical issues. So let's talk about a few of them. And I'd like to start with accountability, because Kirsten has this famous paper that I love. It's in Journal of Business Ethics, and it's on all things algorithms, I guess I could say. She covers a whole ton of ground. When did you publish that? Like 2018 or something?
2019, I think.
But what I really like about this paper is at the end, and it's all too short, you start talking about, are firms responsible for the algorithms they develop, and to what extent are they responsible? And I think that's a really hairy question, isn't it? Because you don't know what your algorithm is going to do. So how can you be responsible for it? And how should you be? Saying they're responsible is fine, but I don't know.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me. They know a lot more than they like to say. So everything seems like a surprise, and they had no idea there was going to be some form of bias or harm. But there's a lot of testing that computer scientists can do before deploying AI or an algorithm in any specific context. So there's kind of a lot of knowns that they could know if they looked into it. And so in that paper, what I was arguing was that not only should we think of firms as being responsible for any harms or rules that they're breaking, or unfairness of the algorithm or fairness of the algorithm, whatever criteria that we're using, that we also need to think of firms as being responsible for delegating who does what in the decision. So what I mean by that is, if you create a black box where the user can't really see what's going on, there's no dashboard showing kind of how the predictions or categorizations are going and trending, whether or not more women are being hired versus less women being hired, if there's any type of protected categories. I mean, there's all sorts of dashboards that could create. If there's no mechanism to identify, judge mistakes, then really what the developer is doing is saying, you user, don't worry about identifying and judging the mistakes. I have created a black box. I am going to be responsible for it. And if they want the users, the adopting organization, to be responsible for the mistakes that are inevitably going to happen, then they really need to create a mechanism in the program that they're developing to be able to identify, judge, and fix mistakes. And so
yeah, that makes sense. But come on, let's look at Facebook right now. We're right now in the midst of them. They have these algorithms and they feed people particular tidbits that maybe are unpalatable to a lot of people. When they initially created these algorithms, they didn't know this particular outcome would happen. Now they have to deal with this outcome. Can we really hold these companies somehow accountable and responsible ex ante for things that I mean, it's so difficult. Once you put something out in the world, you're not sure of all the unintended consequences of the thing you put out into the world, right?
But Facebook's a good example. They're actively monitoring that, right? They are doing the thing that I'm suggesting, which is they're both the developer and the adopter. So they're kind of combined, right? And so they have a team that is regularly monitoring their recommendation algorithm to find out which way are we trending. If we tweak it a little bit, what's our outcome going to be? What metrics are they using? So they're hyper aware of what's going on. And there's all these, I mean, not just now, but like I wrote a teaching case on this called Recommending the Insurrection, which is just the idea that this recommendation algorithm is something that they have tons of internal research on. They know what's going on. So it's not like they deployed it and just said, oh, let's see what happens. They are actively monitoring it and are kind of, and what we need to think about is that is just a constant thing that we need to be thinking about. Not only should Facebook be doing that, which they are. Now we might not agree on their decision as to how to manage it, but they are actively managing it. but we need to think about that for all types of algorithms, hiring algorithms, predictive policing algorithms, any type of algorithm that's put out into the wild that needs to be actively managed to identify, judge, and fix mistakes. So I think Facebook's actually a great example that it's possible and that they have computer scientists doing all the time. We just might not agree with their decision as to how to manage it, but they are making conscious decisions all the time about that.
So Kirsten, what I'm hearing is that what people like us often like to do is we say like, oh look, when we use technology, all sorts of intended and unintended things happen. It's dynamic and it's generative and all sorts of things. Like we talked a couple of weeks ago about the spirit of technology. When designers design something into the system, then we realize that people do all sorts of other things with it. Now, what you're saying is we shouldn't be so naive that the designers, the developers, they do know what is possible and they do know what's going to happen and they do monitor on an ongoing basis what really people do with their technologies. So us saying, all of that is generative and full of potential, and yes, it could have unanticipated, unintended consequences, is a little bit too naive to think of in this world. And I think is that fair to say, that characterization?
Yeah, I mean, naive, it seems too harsh, but I agree that like Facebook, going back to Facebook, there's a ton of computer scientists within Facebook that were advocating for managing the AI a different way, right? And it's the policy people, not the computer scientists, that were arguing the opposite. So it's not as though they weren't being thoughtful about it. And there's a lot of engineers that are super thoughtful about the designs and the value-laden decisions that they're making all the time. So they do know a lot more than we give them credit for, especially I always say when people say, well, there's no way to know what's going on with machine learning. And I'll always say, they know a lot more than we realize. And you just have to ask the right computer scientist. Now, if you put in charge of an AI program in your organization, the English major from undergrad that you just taught how to do machine learning on the fly, that's a lot different than hiring the PhD in computer science that does like statistical machine learning, that really understands the theory behind it. So not all machine learning developers are the same. And sometimes when they say they don't understand, maybe they don't. But the key is that someone knows a lot more about what's going on, if that makes sense.
Aren't we asking too much from these managers and these developers in a sense? Because they're following this and they're doing it. But first off, there's usually not a black and white standard by which you can judge whether something is ethical or not. And secondly, people can self-organize. And I think about that moral machine thing they were doing at MIT, right? Where they were trying to figure out, should the car kill the old person or the young person, the fit people or the fat people, the dogs or the old people, you remember what I'm talking about?
Yeah.
And they were trying to come up with some sort of universal rules by which they can program into their AI to kill some people rather than others and thus reflect the general moral sentiment. Instead, what they found is that there is no singular ethical standard. And maybe they should just run these cars the way we run trains, right? Just have them show up, have them depart, and let people organize around the predictable machine rather than having the machine make moral decisions. Can't we, why are we putting so much pressure on these organizations and on these managers when if they just say, look, this is what our algorithm does, now self-organize around it? Right.
Well, they're not doing that, number one, right? I mean, that's the nature of the algorithm, if I understand it correctly, most often is called a trade secret and kept confidential.
Yeah, but look at Facebook. They could just say, we put popular content, now deal, right? And we get rid of, say, pornography and some other bad things. And other than that, it is what it is. It's a community. And let people self-organize around it, no? Maybe they should have
for the Facebook specifically?
Well, that sort of thing.
Yeah. I think there's no one answer idea that's just true of I'm not like there's only one true way of thinking about ethics person, right? So I'm not going to say there's a capital T truth with like one theory, capital T again. So just like I was listening to the podcast you had around fairness with Lily and her co-authors. I'll just put her first, but Lily and her co-authors. And the idea of fairness is a good one. There's so many definitions, but that's true whether you're talking about AI or not. Like, so when I teach regular business ethics in quotes, we have to talk about like, what are the different definitions of fairness and how would you apply them in different ways? And how does it illuminate this problem specifically? And so if we think of AI decisions as just augmenting business decisions, so they're not, the corporation is still in charge of hiring, whether they use a certain like AI program or any type of analytics program to augment their decision, that's their choice, but they still are responsible for the hiring decision, or the Volkswagen case, the EPA pollution decision. Like I think it's better if we think of it as an augmented tool that we still have to abide by the rules and norms and laws that govern that business decision. Then interestingly enough, that kind of flips the conversation. And then we turn to the engineers, if I'm in the business school, and turn to the engineers and say, I have a problem. I have to make a hiring decision. And these are all not only the rules and the laws, but here are the norms around in our company hiring. How can you create an AI program that actually conforms to that? And that's actually a problem that engineers can do, right? As I was an engineer undergrad, but engineers undergrad, like we regularly get business problems that are quite contextualized. Like we need a robot that goes into this manufacturing. What type of manufacturing is it? What are the OSHA rules? What are the labor laws? How does it impact the workers? Like that's a normal engineering question to have.
Yeah.
And so I think in some ways we've allowed certain folks in data analytics to kind of get out of that engineering umbrella. Someone said to me once, well, engineers don't think about, ethics or the impact on humans. And I was like, really, that's actually all they do. They are constantly taking human problems. And so I think in some ways we need to turn the question around. Instead of saying, let the computer scientists do whatever they want, and then we'll just take it. We should be turning around to them and saying, this is our problem. How can you build a program that will let me do that? And these are the confines of the problem. I actually think that engineering would respond to that.
See, I wanted to make 2 points, but they're sort of large tangents. Let me start with the first. I mean, you sounded very nice now. In the paper, I thought you were a little bit more provocative. I mean, you drew a parallel between technology and guns, the gun industry.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, right. So and I thought, whoa, okay. As an IS person, Nick always says we have the technology enthusiasts in our genre, right? You can't come out and liken us to guns. I mean, guns are bad. Yeah. Technologies are good, aren't they? I mean,
you're German. In Germany, guns are bad. In the U.S., guns are one. We all. Kirsten has a couple guns on her right now. She has one in her shoe. Yeah. So, and the other thing is you, Wrecker, are an engineer as a German, whether you're an engineer or not, just being
as a German,
you're automatically an engineer by birth, right?
By birth, yeah, and by birth. No, but I'm serious, that's a pretty hefty parallel you draw there, right? But it's interesting, I mean, because that question has been asked to the gun factory. How can you produce the guns? To what extent are you responsible for what people do with it, right? And you're basically saying that's the same thing when we talk about some algorithm or some digital technology, whether the companies or whoever design it is responsible for what we do with it.
That's right. And I mean, it's true. So there's a lot of design decisions with guns, even like, do you make the hand grip so that fingerprints don't touch it? You know what I mean? Like fingerprints won't grab onto it so that you can't actually trace anything. Do you make it there's all these different types of things, do you have gun safety that's mandatory on it? There's all these things that you can design into guns. It's not like a neutral product in a lot of ways. And so I think, one, it's not neutral. So I would say this. Within people that study technology, there is a group that will argue that technology is neutral. It's that it's kind of I don't know how to, like a blank slate, and that users will do whatever they want with it, and there's no design decisions that impact the users.
Yeah. So that I would say that's the IS tradition is that we generally think morally neutral, but then the STS tradition, which is I imagine where you're going with this, generally says, well, no, actually all technology is value laden, right? And although there's some overlap between those traditions, they don't necessarily embrace each other.
I mean, like, you can argue that there is broad consensus that technology is socially constructed, and if it's socially constructed, then of course it carries not only the biases that's also established, but also the norms and the morals, etc., and so forth.
But so this is the way I look at it, Wrecker. Throughout the history, say, of management, right? The way we thought of ethics was essentially the worker. And this goes in the early days of information systems as well. The only way we were thinking about ethics was the worker, right? We thought of them as stakeholders. There was the humanist movement. There was all of that in order to make sure management doesn't exploit the worker. Then in around the 90s, sustainability. All right. And then Kirsten, tell me if this is correct, but this is my construction of the history of ethics research, right? So first it was just the worker, and there were the old, like the Mumford's ethics work, and the Scandinavian tradition in system development was all about like labor unions, humanism, making sure the worker is not trampled. The whole socio-technical tradition, right, of Trist and Bamforth and all that, it was all about the worker. Then in the 90s-ish, right? Then came the, I guess, balanced scorecard, triple bottom line. We added sustainability. And then ethics moved. Yeah, we're still concerned with humanism and the worker and all of that, but now we're also concerned with the natural environment. And then I would argue that much of the research, management research into ethics until very recently was either about sustainability or kind of treating workers fairly, stakeholder maybe, that sort of. And then what happened is with the data boom, we realized, wait a second, we can't just think of these as machines anymore. They're learning machines. They're different. There's fairness, there's privacy, there's new levels of labor substitution. All of a sudden, since about, say, 2015, technology ethics, digital technology ethics is exploding. And this is the time that, well, it's the most relevant issue in every organization and every society of our time. And it's still sustainability and humanism matter, and this is wrapped up in it. But I feel like this tech ethics thing right now is exploding, right?
What is it, Kirsten?
So I think I would say the history of business ethics is a little bit different, but I can see why in a management journal, OB workers and entrepreneur and environment gets the most traction in management journals versus within the field of business ethics, because that would miss strategy. So normally in business ethics, we split between people that focus inside the firm. So workers, leadership, top management team, maybe corporate governance, that kind of straddles. And then second, there's a group of us that focus on outside the firm. So interactions with users, consumers, strategy, industry-wide, those types of macro issues. And so you can think of—
So marketing and consumerism and that sort of thing would be—
that type of thing. You can talk about environmentalism in that as well, because that's external to the firm. So if you think about like the borders of the firm being kind of like how the field of business ethics could be split. So Ann Tembrunzel at Notre Dame, OB, me, macro, right? So I'm more a macro person. So I think that the environmental and this is just part of the journals, is that management has a space for OB because they don't have to do normative work. If they're talking about OB, they can actually measure things and do empirical work. So that's quote easier to get. It's an easier story to tell within a journal editorial process. I'll just say that much. And then the environmental just has they would say they took forever for people to listen to them, which I would agree with, but they eventually got traction and started actually being more widely published. And part of that is just a cohort issue that no one cared about it. Same with technology ethics right now. You'll notice the people that talk about technology ethics are all young, right? Except for me, doctoral students, junior faculty, postdocs. Like it's a very cohorted issue right now. And if you teach it, like students, whether they could be anyone, and they come in and want to talk about it. And so you have this problem. I was talking to someone else looking for a PhD, and I just said, you're probably not going to find advisors that already do the work in this area. If you're interested in it, you have to find an advisor that allows you to study it. So just find someone that's kind of open. Look, my advisor was Ed Freeman. He doesn't do anything in technology ethics, but he was extremely supportive of me taking like a quarter of my classes in the engineering school with Deb Johnson, who does engineering ethics and STS. And so I was able to, he was just very supportive of it, the whole thing, even though he probably thought it was like a side gig and wasn't going to go anywhere. You know what I mean? Because he even asked me recently, how did you know? And I said, I didn't know. I was just really stubborn. And so when people would tell me, why are you studying this? No one cares. I would just be That's cool. I think it's important.
And he's got this massive, Ed Freeman has this massive beard too, doesn't he? Has he always had that beard, or is that a recent thing?
No. That's not a COVID beard. He predates COVID on that.
So I fully agree with you, Kirsten. I do think that explains a lot why we have certain research foci over time. It explains a lot with what business schools have traditionally focused on, which people were hired as professors, what these people were doing, and therefore what sort of, the future cohorts were. The example that I always use is privacy and security in our IT security. Very few people do this. And because very few people do this, there's not a lot of research, there's not a lot of
Right.
traction. Therefore, they don't get a lot of PhDs, which is why we don't have more of these experts and so forth. And I think the same applies to ethics. I think I said in one of the earlier episodes, I can probably name 5 people in the field of IS that do ethics in a 50-year
Right.
history. That's nothing,
Right.
absolutely nothing, right? And you're a business ethics person. And in my old university in Cologne, there was one ethics person in our business school.
Right.
In Hamburg, I don't even know, so that's the extent of it. There's a marketing department with 7 professors and 50 students, but ethics has always been one of these. And it's a promising sign when you say that the new cohort, the new generation comes in and they want to study what they think is important, because I think it's fair to say that our generation, the ones that came before us, we did what drove the business. Environmentalism, that came in as soon as there was a market for these products. And, as green products and green marketing and these sorts of things actually created money, that's when the business school researchers focused on it, not before that, So, and I think that holds true for ethics as well. Maybe it gets some traction now. It certainly hasn't done that in the past. Is that fair to say? It's always been a niche.
We can't just say ethics. Let's say, all right, so Kirsten, what should I, if I'm a PhD, so, what should they study and how do they get published in JBE? You're the tech editor for Journal of Business Ethics, Journal of Business Ethics. I mean, I think MISQ and other journals are totally open to ethics research now, where maybe they weren't quite as much in the past. But how do you say get published in JBE? Like, what would the process look like?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that, so going back to, I'll call him Recker's point about be casual now. Yeah. I think the trick is, this is like, it's a chicken and egg problem for any new area. Like, and this happened when I was first studying privacy. If you don't have an editor that knows reviewers, even an awesome paper is going to go just nowhere. And so it's just really difficult unless you find that editor that also knows the reviewers, that knows the literature, because there's nuances around, fairness definitions, or like just the question about neutrality versus value ladenness. Like, that's something that we can handle with reviewers that know the area. But if you give it to just like a lay person that is kind of dabbling in the area, then they're just going to say things like, well, it's just neutral, so what are you talking about? You know what I mean? Like, so the problem, there's a little bit of an issue around chicken and egg of getting the right editors in place at MIS Quarterly or elsewhere that then can identify the reviewers and that's really the key, is getting the reviewers that can help out along that way. And because I faced that, I was just thinking about that this morning. I was submitting and I had to go through the editor-in-chief at JBE, because I'm an editor there. But the problem is no one other than me at JBE, because it's just not well known within JBE or management. The reviewers like reference things like book reviews or like really nascent stuff in academy of management that's really not, they're just starting. And so when you get bad reviewers, they're not, I shouldn't say bad, they're just an ill fit. You know what I mean? Like, they just don't know the area. And so they kind of, it is an issue, and it's a trick to find reviewers. And I almost always go outside of the field because I pretty much know like the 8 people within, but a lot of them are IS. So it's interesting to see the number of IS people like Lauren Rue at Maryland, Lily at West Virginia. They're both a part of, like, I have a technology ethics workshop that we run once a month where we workshop papers. And so it's like, there's 8 of us, and someone submits a draft, and then we kind of give them feedback on their draft with the idea of trying to foster it, get better papers out to journals. For JBE, I can't really speak to, it really depends on the editor at the IS journal. And I read that paper on fairness. The difference is that IS has to contribute to IS theory, which it should. That's the whole point of the field. Whereas if you're submitting to JBE, you need to be actually contributing to business ethics theory. And that, as a receiver of journals, many from IS researchers, because JBE is a FT50 journal, it has a very high impact factor now at like 7. And so we get a ton of submissions. And the biggest issue is they are just kind of checking the box on an ethics theory of literally one. I said, you need to ground this in an ethics theory. And they cited dictionary.com for the ethics definition. And I was like, and so I rejected it at that point. And I got like this very mad email back that went to the editor-in-chief. I am an editor at MIS Quarterly, blah, 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 blah. You know what I mean? Like, how dare you you should know better as to how to be an
That was
editor.
Recker,
And I was
by the
like,
way, who wrote that
Yeah.
paper. Did you know that?
it was not.
Don't you know who I am?
Yeah,
Don't you know who
exactly.
I am?
Yeah.
So
And I
there's a
was-
guy.
Oh God.
There's a guy. This is the problem with ethics and information systems. And again, and Recker knows this. Every single people write, they don't read. And
Yes,
I don't know if
yeah.
you're familiar, Kirsten, with Richard Mason's work in the 80s and 90s. And he has a book, like, I don't know if it's 1997 or 95 or something. I can give you the site for the book, but he basically foresaw all of the discussions that are happening, and at least gave a little bit of a kind of theoretical foundation for just about all of the discussions that are happening right now. And a lot of these AI and ethics discussions were actually fairly vibrant in the 80s.
Yeah,
maybe not in the top IS journals, but in various book chapters and like Dick Boland and Richard Mason really, and I think he goes by Dick Mason. He was at Washington, but he really, if anybody wants to get up to speed on foundations of information systems ethics in our field, just look at Mason's work and you'd be surprised at how much he kind of
he's not the only one, right? There's also Roger Clark, who's in Australian IS research, a very old one. He's done a lot of research, not necessarily in AI, but really IS technology ethics around the 90s and 2000s. And, I always felt that he was so alone. He was pushing this topic, and he still is. And he comes across as, this lone wolf howling at the moon and no one cares. And it's like, oh yeah, look at Roger Clark. He's the ethics guys. No one cares. For 20, 30 years easily, right? And that's sort of how it goes, I think, sometimes in our fields, that every 10 years you'll see a special issue on ethics. We're just about due for another one. And then people come up with a few technology ethics cases and a few of these normative papers about what we should be doing in regards to IT and ethics. And poof, that's it. All right. So I don't know whether there's a specific editor at MIS Quarterly specializing on ethics.
Well, and there might not be enough volume to justify it. You know what I mean? Like, I think, so sometimes what journals might do is they could tap a section editor or someone to be the guest editor for a specific article. Like, I mean, it's inefficient to do it that way, but if you don't have the people, it really, I know from my experience, it really kind of grinds the paper to a halt, if that makes sense. Like, because I always would say, like, the journal just doesn't know how to make sense of it. And so they're trying, but they're fitting it into like older theories, or they think it has to show efficiency. And so, or they just don't buy into the term ethics. So you have to, in fact, I was working on a paper with two of our colleagues, and finally it was Hong and Rob at Notre Dame. And Hong was like, can you just overtly use ethics theories? And I was like, oh, I was just trying to hide it in my strategy work. Like I can actually write as if I'm a strategist and just hide my ethical argument within being strategic and having and being more pragmatic. And I was like, oh, I didn't know I could. Like, I didn't know I could actually cite those people. I thought we were trying to hide it. But they were like, no, we think they can handle, overtly talking about business ethics. So I think that is a limiting factor. But I really do. I mean, seeing all the people interested at the doctoral, postdoc, and junior faculty level trained within IS. I was just talking to a doctoral student in Canada, IS, PhD, really interested in the design decisions of programming and how it can impact use. And I was kind of like, oh, that's a great idea. Like someone, met her and said, oh, you should talk to Kirsten about that. And so I just was trying to but she still did an IS PhD, which I think is actually, if you're like IS, that's actually where you can make a big impact, because you can get an IS PhD and just bring in theories of business ethics. Because I actually think that that's where you get the most interesting ideas, is when you traverse two fields. When you're for me, technology and business ethics. And first of all, it actually widens the journals that I can think about, because I'm just looking at a phenomenon of interest. And then I'm a little bit agnostic as to the theory that I'm using or the language that I'm using at any time. And so I can kind of switch around. And so if something doesn't work at IS, I can go to Business Ethics Journal, or I can go to Law Review or something else. And I think it also, you can go to other people's conferences, you get all these great ideas, and you're like, wow, they're really grappling with some interesting things. How does that actually impact my theories in business ethics? Like, how can I take that back to what I'm doing? And so it's slower. And I actually think it makes for a longer career, a better career overall. It's sometimes harder in those first 5 to 7 years, because you might be one of the only people. So so I'm not saying that it's easy, and I'm not saying it's an easy thing. Sometimes you have to go to different conferences and stuff, but I found it the most fruitful. It's something you can do.
So can we turn this around a little bit? So if we buy into this argument saying there's a new generation coming up that is interested in the connection, let's say between technology and ethics, that is really crossing the boundaries of different disciplines in the sense of that they can be in IAS and trying to get their work published there, but they can also go to the Journal of Business Ethics and perhaps even to, you mentioned strategic management. So really you have to up across. I agree. It's very valuable. It's very difficult. You have to know 3 communities, know the languages and stuff like this. So if we assume this is really happening, what should we be doing? I mean, what can we do to propel and support that? Let me give you an example. I mentioned this a couple of weeks ago. I was talking to John King. John King is one of our old guys, editors for a Journal of the AIS, where they started a new section, a paper section in the journal called the policy section. And I talked to him and asked him, what is it, right? And they want policy papers. Now, that's not my point. The point is that, in passing, he said, well, Jan, this is not something for young scholars. This is for old people because, this is not a real research paper. Maybe they don't get credit for it. So, it's a short paper too. It's only 3,000 words. So he sort of made it out to be a category of papers like INO papers that's reserved for old people, but not for young people. So, and I'm sitting here thinking, well, if we continue it like this, that we sort of quasi-reserve certain categories of contributions only to established folks or, not young people, then we're never going to get there. So can we turn that around and say like, okay, here's a new category, ethics, and no one older than 45 can even submit.
Yeah, I think that's a good question. So I'd say 2 things. One is that I always advise folks younger in the business school that it's important to not only to flush out their journal articles that are traditional, that the outside reviewers and the APT committee will recognize with chapters, policy papers, like it kind of tells the fuller story. And so it's not, and sometimes you can just do those single authored. So it's not as much, you just do like 3,000 words or you do something that's practitioner oriented. I have to say, those are some of the things that get the highest citations because you have to write in a way that's accessible to lots of different people. It also can draw people into your work. So someone from like nursing reads your policy paper on IS and they're kind of like, oh, what else does Nick write? And then they kind of go in and look at other things. And so it shouldn't detract from your the things that will get you tenure, because that's a job in and of itself to get tenure. But it is a way to kind of flush out the fuller story so that people can say, look, he or she is actually contributing and she's known in this area. So it's not, I don't find those things to be a waste. They can't be instead of. I always say that they cannot be instead of, but I don't find them to be a waste because outside reviewers do kind of slip in that understanding that you actually are known in an area. It can help citations and stuff like that.
I like that very much. The last couple of days, I was on hiring committees for some reason, for some universities. So I looked at a lot of CVs, the recent weeks, and wrote letters basically. And what I noticed is that a lot of people that were sort of applying for tenure track, they had their A hits and they try to maximize A hits. So they really were going for how many good journal publications. And usually the papers were on different things. So, for example, there was this one paper on gamification that ended up in the top journal. And the second top journal was about something completely different. And there was just one paper on gamification. And I was like, well, if you're the gamification expert, shouldn't you have 10 papers? One of which might be your, God knows, MISQ paper or whatever. But shouldn't there be a book chapter? Shouldn't there be this other thing? Like you said, and because that would tell the story, that's my thing. I really know it all.
Right.
And, no one expects you to have 10 of these papers already. But I found it weird that people said, I'm an expert in X and I can find only one paper. Yes, that paper is a great paper, but it's only one. How can that be? Right. So I think there is something to it, what you're saying, that you said, like, if I'm an expert on something, like I did process modeling and looking back, I wish I didn't have so many papers on this because it's boring, but I really knew this stuff. Right. And there's some of these were top, a lot of them were not, but I really think I marked that area for a while. Right. So there's something to this. And I think that has gone missing. If I look back, now we always complain that the deans are counting, but I think the young faculty, they're counting journals as well. It's not only the deans that count.
Oh no, right. I agree with you. And I think I always, my joke is that it makes it harder to get tenure, but easier to get full, because you're then known as an expert in an area. And then the other thing is you have to practice writing about something, and not always for an A journal. Like, so sometimes you just have to get the first crack at an idea out, and that might be a chapter, and maybe one paragraph of that chapter that you wrote ends up being something super important, and then you take that and then it becomes like an important journal article. So I find them to be sometimes helpful, to be forcing myself to write about a new area and then think, okay, what is interesting about this? And then kind of maybe get a journal article out on the other side. Or I've done it the other way, where I've had a journal article and I've realized I'm just packing way too much and I'm talking too much about practical implications. So what I really need to do is like split it and send it to MASQ executive, you know what I mean? Like, and then that's a separate paper that's coming out of an actual journal article. So I've done it both ways. And I do think it's important. I also do the same thing when I find someone's like all over the place with and they don't have a story as to like, what are they known for? Or what are they working to be known for? I get worried that they're just always like the person doing data analysis. Like, are they just hopping from place to place to do the experience, the analysis, and they're not kind of contributing theory in any way, which is a concern.
But there again, if it's a particular type of analysis that they happen to be good at and it's unique, then maybe that's a thing. Yeah, this is a tough one. I really like what you said about it's harder to get tenure, but easier to get full. I think those are right. Getting tenure is about counting. And, and I think incentives are also, as we've talked about in other podcasts, they're kind of not aligned to creating people who know a domain very deeply. They're aligned to, and especially in our field, and we've talked about this, Kirsten, in the recent podcasts, is that people come to our field because they're excited about the phenomena. Right.
Mm-hmm.
So they, and when the phenomenon is a little bit older, then they want to jump on the new one. Then they want to jump on the new one. So we have this field of people who are excited about technology and don't necessarily want to focus on old technology too much. They like the chasing the new shiny object. Right. So you'll see a lot of kind of opportunistic activity, I think more so in our field than other fields, although it's quite prevalent in all sorts of fields, I imagine.
Oh, we're not focused on the new thing in business ethics. I'm not being sarcastic. I mean, they just aren't. Like they have their Aristotle, and they're just going to keep hammering on environmental issues until it's over. I mean, so they're not very tied to current what's going on. In fact, that's one of the things that I think is missing in particularly my field of business ethics, is that there isn't this constant kind of check against actually what's going on, versus like in law, they have to always be up to date on what's going on currently. And even if you're doing like digital consumer marketing, you have to be up to date with current marketing trends. Otherwise you look kind of odd.
I noticed you clearly publish a lot in law. You're not a lawyer. How do you publish in a law journal as a non-lawyer? You just know the law.
Well, I'm pretty active at the Privacy Law Scholars Conference. So that's like this nationwide or worldwide conference on privacy law. And that's one of those other disciplines that I became part of. Like, I'm on their program committee to run the conference. There's like 10 of us that run it. And so when I was thinking about going outside the discipline, I actually advise, if you have a reason to, go outside business schools. Like, I think you learn, like I'll go to computer science conferences, or I'll go to privacy law scholars conferences, or there's like We Robot is an offshoot of Privacy Law Scholars Conference, which is more focused on, it sounds like robots, but it's really around algorithms and AI. And there's a lot of law folks. You learn a lot. I always joke that when they're talking about someone's rights being violated, we have to think of that as someone's stakeholder interest being concerned. You know what I mean? Like, so they're constantly thinking about what, like, doomsday scenarios of the new technology. And so it's kind of interesting to see what they're doing in that area. And the law review articles, I mean, so a bunch of those some are by myself and some are with Helen Niesenbaum, I guess, maybe half and half, who's a philosopher. And the main idea is that you just have to, it's not that deep into the law. So I'm not making no one Supreme Court is citing my work, but it's more of like, you have to understand the law in a way similar to if I was publishing in IS, I'd have to learn, like, I've done stuff around, like, you have to understand like trust within IS, for example, and definitions of trust within IS are just different than definitions of trust within business ethics. And it's not, you just have to learn their theories and then contribute and figure out how you extend that theory. And so in some ways it's the same idea. You just look at the current regulations within privacy or something along those lines.
So Kirsten, you're clearly a technology and ethics expert. So you're jumping between these fields. And I know you've published in our field as well, and you've published in ethics and apparently also in law journals. But arguably, I hadn't heard of you. Nick sent me your papers and I read them, and then I realized, oh, you also publish in our journals. I read them too, etc. and so forth. So I don't do research on ethics, so that might be a reason. But where I'm getting at is, it always strikes me, how do we get the communities to be informed from one another better? So my theory is always we have to go to the watering holes. So just as much as you go to the law conferences, I think if Nick and I, we want to make sure that our managing AI ideas go into the management field, I think we have to go there. It doesn't help that we do an MISQ workshop and we do an IS podcast. We have to go to AOM. We have to go to, I don't know, EGOS and some of these places where these people
right.
meet. Right. And does that match what you've experienced jumping between these fields?
Yeah, and I think conferences actually matter, because I don't go to Informs. I've been to Informs once or twice just to be on an invited panel, but I'm not there. I'm not submitting to Informs. I'm not going to be. So that's why people within IS I haven't really worked to contribute to that field, if that makes sense. Like I'm more active within Privacy Law Scholars Conference, or a lot of the papers that I read are within computer science and the proceedings from their conferences. But they have a more robust discussion around fairness, AI, ethics, transparency, than within IS. So, it's nascent within IS. And so, but it's pretty robust. It's been going on for a while within computer science. And so, but I do think that's part of the trick of actually going to different places. And publishing is one thing. I think publishing is important. I think I haven't published in like ISR and MS Quarterly, which are the big ones. And so I think if I had published there, then people would know, they would have a reason to kind of find out what else I had written, if that makes sense. That's how I would work. If I see an article that I like within MIS Quarterly, I click and say, oh, what else has Nick written? And then I kind of go down and try to find, no matter where it is, I want to see where else
I think that does happen. But, by and large, publishing is not enough advertisement anymore, right? So one of the reasons is you can publish anything anywhere, really, if you really wanted to. Of course, there's only so many top journals. There always have been, but the space is just basically unlimited now, which then means there's papers everywhere, and you have to help people find them, right? So which is why that, I don't know, academics take more to social media and all these sorts of things, because I think they have to, right? You have to get your ideas out there. It's not enough to just have it published somewhere, because it's too many. You can't read it all. You can't even see it all, right? Yeah.
Well, and then they do these things like Kirsten has this book coming out, The Ethics of Data Analytics, where what you did is went and I guess you found the papers you like and you're reprinting them in your book. Like what was the story there? So it's
kind of like an anthology. And so it's like the papers from all over. There could be law review papers, philosophers, computer scientists, business ethicists. It's kind of all over the place. And then there's like 3,000 or 4,000 word front piece for every chapter to explain what the tensions are for that particular phenomenon, and then how to read the articles that you're about to read. So, a paragraph on each one to say what are the key points that you should take away from this, the chapter on surveillance by Lyons.
If you look at your chapters, it's funny because some come from the MIT Technology Review, right, which is basically a magazine. Then you have others from the Journal of Moral Philosophy. This is a total mission. So I haven't seen the book. This is just
MIT Technology Review are cases. They're not.
Yeah.
Those are actual like news articles, like the Washington Post or the Houston
Wall Street
Chronicle,
Journal. Yeah.
Wall Street Journal. Those are news articles for a case. There aren't that many cases written. I teach case-based. So I start everything with a case and we just discuss the case, and then the theory comes out from the case. And so each chapter has real life cases, either that I wrote, some of them for the book, and then some of them are just, I don't know. There's a great one in Pasco. I think it's Florida, or is it Texas? Anyway, I think it's outside of Tampa Bay Times, where a school system is used an algorithm to predict who's going to be a criminal of their students, and then they pass those names on to the police.
Oh, Jesus Christ.
Proactively arrest these kids.
Oh boy, yeah.
It's like it's really I say they're great because they're phenomenal to teach. Yeah. They're just great cases to teach because the students, there's so much wrong that you can really dig into like the way that they've implemented the technology, and that how they're kind of misusing the purpose of the, because it's supposed to be identifying kids at risk so they can receive more guidance. I mean, that not to be sent to the police. So anyway, each chapter has cases, and then the theory goes along with it.
So I still have this on my mind. I really have to ask this question. It's a bit of a tangent, right? But hear me out. So I sometimes think about a conference that I've attended and keynotes, and I'll ask myself, which keynotes do you even remember? And the answer is, of course, most of them I couldn't tell you what the conference keynote was last year. I could not. I have no idea. I just vaguely remember one from a couple of years ago, just only because it was so boring. It was by some Toyota guy. Anyway, the one in the last 10 years that really stuck with me, that kept me thinking, is actually related to IT and ethics. It was held by Paul Durish, who's a sociologist, like at the intersection of computer science and sort of sociology. And he gave a talk in Melbourne a couple of years ago on the social lives of algorithms. So his opening case was a case of Google's predictive recommendation algorithm. You know, when you type in the search and it sort of makes recommendations how to complete a sentence. And it was used by, I think, a gender and equity initiative by the UN. Big poster saying women should, and then the Google recommendation said, be in the kitchen. Women should not vote, should be this and this and this and that. And it created an upheaval in saying, the Google algorithm is biased, it's gender biased. And then Google came on and said, no, that's just very simple algorithm. We just filter by frequency. It's humans that are biased. It's only in the data. And then he used that as an opening case to talk about, is it the data or is it the algorithm? Is it both? Anyway, what I wanted to get to, his implication that he presented at the end is, he basically said, if you want to understand what algorithms are doing, you have to study the people that construct these algorithms. And he linked it to ethnography. So he said, let's go into the rooms of the computer science, the developers, and watch over their shoulder and listen to them when they make decisions, because they do make ethical decisions. The design of an autonomous car is a good example. They do think about this stuff. And they do make decisions about how to code this algorithm this way or the other. And that really rang true with me. And that's the one keynote really that stuck with me with this case over the last 10 years.
Ethics is sexy. It's people like it. They're whenever I do ethics in class, whenever I speak about ethics in business, you get a good response. People are interested in it, usually far more interested in the other things we do. But I will tell you this, I just put women should into Google, and you know what the first thing I got out was?
What?
Dress modestly. So FYI. And then the very first thing I got out of men should, I'm not going to tell you what the second thing was because it's pornographic, but the first one was men should always pray. Oh, so women should dress modestly and men should always pray. So I think there's a certain
to the 50s we go.
Unfortunately, they know your IP address, Nick. So I'm sure.
I wonder what it has to. No, I use DuckDuckGo usually.
Oh, you do?
That is. So Google, maybe it has something on me. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, to your point, Record, that so a friend of mine, Katie Shilton, is at the University of Maryland iSchool. And by the way, I think iSchools are a great place to look for this really nuanced take of development and deployment of technology. They're kind of, they're very few within the United States, but that's the bigger schools, and they're really good at doing this. And it's a little bit more organic for them. They don't have to pretend along the way. But she does stuff on value-laden decisions of designers and developers. And she actually will go in and do grounded studies to understand what are she calls them value levers, the levers of conversation that open up the conversation to ethics. She's Katie Shilton, University of Maryland iSchool. And so I think that type of work is super important, not only for understanding how they are currently in a descriptive way, but then it would give us, the theory to go in and actually suggest, if you want to talk about this during development, how would you, like in a how should we and could we do this in the future to think about how computer scientists and developers could actually think about this. And so I agree. And I think that's what I would hope. I mean, IS has the time and space in their journals to actually be super thoughtful and very theoretically grounded in this. And I think part of the reason why ethics doesn't translate quickly and easily or as pervasively within IS is there's a tendency to focus on efficiency or profit. So one of the current AI articles within in success. Well, one of them was like, what type of design decisions in machine learning actually leads to literally more capital from venture capitalists. Like that was the DV that they were talking about. So that's that, and I think that's in MIS Quarterly. So that type of focus, like, and if you think that's why, you know, ethics can feel like a chirping bird outside if the mainstream of the conversation is around efficiency and profit maximization. Even if businesses don't talk that way all the time, you know, it still is, it's easier to quantify, you know, if you're looking for a DV, and that ends up being a problem.
But businesses are talking that way now. That's the difference between, you know, when I was in college and got out of college versus now, right? Every business is talking this way. They're concerned with privacy, fairness.
Correct. Yes,
issues,
I agree.
Right?
I agree.
And in the old days, they weren't. So for us to
Right.
publish, and I think, you know, for our special issue in managing AI, we were actually surprised at how few fairness submissions we got. I think there's a huge appetite for it.
I agree.
And I think there are very few people doing it. And I would encourage, I would like to encourage young people to pursue it, but I think it's a higher risk, also higher reward path for their careers. I don't know. Would you agree with that?
I would agree with this because when you told that story, I fully agree that we have this sort of typical utilitarian business dependent variables very often. That said, I've never experienced a reviewer or an editor demanding that. Absolutely not.
Right.
It's just, I think it's just that most people are doing it, not because anyone is asking for it, just because that's what business school researchers do. We look for profit maximization, we look for efficiency optimization and so forth. I've really never seen anyone saying, well, you know, your dependent variable isn't all that interested. Try replacing it with profit. You know, I don't think that happens.
Right.
I do think the editors in many journals, not only MISQ, right? If you think here in Germany, the Visa journal, that has a very varied types of papers that it publishes, lots of papers in ethics and other stuff. So I do think there are.
Well, it's easier to publish. It's easier to measure a dependent variable around success than it is around some sort of ethical outcome, right?
That is true as well.
But I think that what you're managing AI special issue is a good example with that one paper of like how you could actually bring in a nuanced understanding. They conflated discrimination with fairness, but even around discrimination, and how would it actually influence, you know, what is already going on within IS. So if you think about it, like you can change the DV, but you can also talk about like the different concepts that go into like a major theory or something like that, and how would we augment what's already going on, or how does this change the major components? And so you can still do that within IS theory and just make the IS theory more robust in some ways, and so not as thin or kind of thicker. If that makes sense.
What I heard is they conflated discrimination and fairness. So clearly the editors didn't know what they were doing in that paper, Wrecker.
No,
we needed to get Kirsten.
That's totally. I think that that's completely normal. I think that that's a ton of CS people talk about fairness, but when you read it, they're talking about discrimination. Does that make, like, so I actually think that that's not just to that paper, like tons and tons of people conflate the two things. But they also point out that not everyone, that the issues around discrimination or fairness change based on what decision you're making. So what your concerns are, what you're looking to protect, it's not universal. So I thought it was a really nuanced kind of approach to it that they brought. And I thought it was a great paper.
So Kirsten, I have one final question, if I may. So when I read your 2019 JBE paper, right, I felt that, and you mentioned this as well, it's a normative paper. You're writing about what we should be doing, what companies should be doing, and then this sort of normative voice is not very common in our field. So is this an artifact of this particular paper, or is this common for business ethics papers that are just more normative? And if that's the case, how do you write such a normative paper? I don't think I've ever written such a normative paper myself. Would you agree, Nick? That's not very common, right? So that level of normative, prescriptive type of writing.
Only with methods. If you want to be normative, talk about a method.
Yeah. You know, it's a good point. So I think that there's within theory papers, you can be descriptive and theoretical. And I think those are really hard to write. And I think normative, you're opening yourself up to more critiques, because you really have to try to justify the should, instead of like, you know, if you do this, we think this will happen and we think that's a good idea. You know, that's kind of like a more pragmatic way, or not more instrumental way to talk about things. I think within business ethics, it's much more common to be normative. It's also common within law reviews, which is why writing in law reviews is really not as hard for me, because you have to be normative. You have to say what should happen, what's wrong, and say why it's wrong, and what should happen in the future, and the criteria for it being wrong. And so I think that there are certain folks that are more comfortable writing that way. But you're right. It's funny that you say that. It's like when I co-author with someone who's not normative, like it's interesting for them to say, well, how would you write this should part? Like, like how would you like what will that say? And I was like, and then how would you justify that? And so it's kind of interesting. It is a stretch. When we, even in business ethics, we split ourselves, like I said about macro versus micro, we split ourselves between people who are purely descriptive and people who do normative work. And so some people do both. Like I've done empirical work that's descriptive, but usually that has like a normative implication. Like, so I had another one about the privacy paradox, and I did an empirical piece, but then I said what should happen. And I argued why it like undermined corporate responsibility or whatever, something along those lines. But I think that's it. I think it's much more common within business ethics and in law than it ever is within IS, which is another reason why getting it, you almost would have to do a descriptive business ethics piece initially in IS. I think you could have like an issues and opinions piece that was very should like. I think that would be fine.
Yeah, that as well. But also I think there's immense value in normative writing also for theory development. See, when with younger folks, when I engage in theory development, I always tell them, you got to be more assertive. You got to be a little bit more prescriptive, right? You got to be out there and tell people what you think. And a lot of people struggle with this, probably because they're not used at all to telling others what to do. Who am I to say what you should do, right? But so this normative voice really helps with being assertive and stating how things are, even, in a theory piece.
Even in teaching it, it's interesting to teach to college students because it's easier to teach to MBA students because they're used to telling people what to do. But undergrads are just getting out of the realm of their parents. And so they're very hesitant to say something's bad or good. Like a lot of them will just be like, well, who am I to say? It's almost like they are so tired of being prescribed.
And I agree with them, actually. Who are they to say? They have very little to say, as do most humans. And so the trick is,
you have a college student as a child. So, that's why you're saying that.
So no. And I know that, and I think the problem with telling people to be normative and to be assertive is that they are ill-equipped to do so. Now, one thing I heard you say, Kirsten, is that name the standard by which you're making the right? So don't make normative statements. Don't go out there and tell the world what they should do. You don't know, right? None of us do. However, a scholar would say, by this standard, and then clearly point out the standard, argue for why they're using that standard, and then say, according to this standard, this seems to be the course of action. That's how I think a scholar makes a normative argument. And that's actually what you did in this paper. This whole idea of, I have this theory, I'm pulling it out of the air, and this is what should happen, is the problem, right? I think that's the problem with a lot of what we have when people think through not just ethics, politics, our lives, right? People have opinions with no consistent basis, right? And the last thing we should do is advocate for that sort of journal.
We'll agree to disagree.
But
I think you just made a should statement, though. Unfortunately.
I did.
What I'm taking away from this is we have a new generation of folks that do much more interesting research, and because they're focusing on more macro external things, ethics, and so forth. We will make sure that Kirsten gets appointed as an editor for MS Quarterly.
Are we doing that?
Well, yeah, absolutely.
You have extra time on your hands.
She's vigorously shaking her head right now.
No time.
No time. Well,
we should anyway.
Yeah, well, that would be a signal, I think, right? That would be a strong signal, and would probably say we welcome these works and send it to us, which is, I think, what the journal want anyway.
I think she volunteered to be a special editor, is what I heard earlier in the thing. She said, hey, send us, if you need a special editor for these.
I did say that part. I didn't
Folks, if you're listening, if you're organizing the next conference, feel free to invite Kirsten. She'll be happily on your program committee, associate editor for your track, session chairs, and all these wonderful service tasks.
I can make up a talk in like 5 minutes, so I can do talks. Yeah.
Well, thanks for coming on, Kirsten. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for having me. This is a lot of fun.
Yeah, thanks for coming onto the show.
Wrecker, see you next time.